We continue with our Sunday Gospel reading in this sermon of Jesus, the Sermon on the Plain as it's known in Luke. And so we've been talking about the last couple of weeks of how the Lord in this sermon is sort of working towards a radical reorientation on our part. As he alludes to today, it's what Jesus is interested in is not merely our behavior, but the inner transformation. All these radical reorientations are about the interior transformation of the heart, so that our heart can be transformed so that we produce good fruit. It's not merely about behavior. So honing in today on one of the things he says of this beam in our eye, the famous why do you notice the splinter in your brother's eye, but do not perceive the wooden beam in your own? Remove the wooden beam from your own eye first. Then you will see clearly to remove the splinter in your brother's eye. So reflecting on that particular passage, what is the beam in our eye, or what distorts our vision of the world, of others, of reality? We might begin with simply looking at what is my vision of the world. Because sometimes from merely reading the news, we might get a distorted view of reality. You see, even if all the news sources we're reading are factual, it often happens that the main headlines that get attention are the most sensational and usually the most horrible things going on in the world. And when we read all of those, we might form a view of the world that perhaps isn't fully reflective of reality, a distortive view of the world. Or, to bring it home a little bit, if someone wanted to get to know the community of Ackley and all they read was the crime reports, then they might begin to think, even though the crime reports are factual, they might begin to form an untrue or distorted view of the community of Ackley. A bunch of criminals who do a bunch of bad things. What a bunch of terrible people. And of course, you would point out to them that, those are factually true, but those crime reports are not representative of the whole of reality of the community of mostly good people here in Ackley. So, what are some of those beams in our eye? I want to highlight, building off of this sort of three things that might be a beam in our own eye that needs to be removed. Number one, my unspoken expectations. This can easily distort our view of another person. In many situations and relationships, we often have unspoken assumptions or unspoken expectations. And so then when someone fails to meet those expectations, we begin to resent them. The problem is, of course, the person didn't know we necessarily had those expectations for them because they were precisely unspoken. And so sometimes if we have experiences of where we have relationships, we start resenting this person for what they failed to do, again, we might need to check the beam in our own eye. Well, have I in fact communicated those expectations for them? Am I resenting them for failing something that they didn't even know they were failing? I know I've certainly done that for people, holding my own unspoken expectations towards them, and also have been on the other side of that. And then it causes a lot of undue resentment, distortion. Well, they should just know. That's usually a good indicator it's an unspoken expectation. Well, they should just know to do it this, that, or the other way. Well, maybe they should. Maybe there's no reason to expect them to. Regardless, to hold them to a standard that hasn't been articulated isn't really fair and can distort the relationship and our vision, and is perhaps a beam in our eye that has to be taken out. Number two, assume positive intent. Another beam in our eye can be our assumption of people's negative intentions. That someone does something, and I assume the worst possible intentions, the most malicious intentions on their part. I heard a quote recently that we tend to judge others by their worst behaviors and ourselves by our best intentions. We judge others by their worst behaviors, but ourselves by our best intentions. We defend ourselves because I intended to do good, but we don't always apply that to others. They did this thing and we just assume the worst possible intentions on their part. Well, clearly this person did this thing to spite me or as a personal offense. But maybe we sometimes need to humble ourselves to recognize that this person's world doesn't revolve around finding ways to offend me. So what do I assume on people's part? Because that can distort our vision. Do I just assume that those people are acting with malice or bad intentions? Or perhaps do I give them the benefit of the doubt and assume that they're trying to do the best they can, are acting with good intentions, even if they fail and even if they hurt me? That might be another beam we have to remove from our eye. And then beam number 3, the purifying of memory. St. John of the Cross, one of our great spiritual masters of our Catholic tradition, in his spiritual writings, one of the things he talks about is part of growing in the spiritual life is allowing the Lord to purify our memory. To purify our memory. I remember the first time I came across it, I didn't really know what he meant. Like, what does that mean? What are you getting at, St. John, here? Because it's not like I'm going to forget those things in my past or so on. The Lord's not going to just delete scenes from the bad things that happened in my life that I just kind of move forward with ignorant bliss. So what is he getting at in purifying our memory? Well, eventually I began to realize that St. John's not talking about allowing the Lord to erase our memories. Rather, we might think about it this way. When I think about a person, of course, there's sort of certain, we might say, the highlight reels of that person that go on replay when we think of that person. Of course, when it's people we love, it tends to be majority the good things. But sometimes, when there's people who we struggle with, the highlight reel I play is all the worst possible aspects about their personality or the things they've done. Again, it's kind of like going back to the headlines or the crime reports. If all I think about of a community is their crime reports, well, factually true, may not be the full picture. And so too it is with the individuals who we engage with in our life. Are we simply reducing them to all the worst possible aspects of them that we've seen? Reducing them to their greatest sins? Reducing them to the things I like least about them? And is that the highlight reel I'm playing? So allowing the Lord to purify our memories, again, isn't necessarily deleting those scenes, but perhaps zooming out, or perhaps recognizing that there should be other scenes also in that highlight reel. Certainly, here's this person's flaws and imperfections, but maybe there's some good things that they've done in the world. Maybe there's good traits about them. Or even if I struggle to see that, still seeing those memories in the context of, here's the Lord actively at work in the life of this sinner. And so yes, there's sin, there's shortcomings, there's failures, but all these scenes, aspects of who they are, is part of a bigger picture, a bigger story. Sort of allowing the Lord to infuse that highlight reel with the story of his grace. What is the Lord doing in the life of that person? And of course, part of what can help us see that is reflecting on our own selves and how the Lord has been at work in the midst of my sinful shortcomings and vices. And thus being able to more easily see that in others. Allowing the Lord to purify our memories. We might take that a step further too. And there's also a way of sort of praying through some of our more painful memories with the Lord and inviting the Lord to help us see, as we go back to some of those more painful memories in our life, Lord, where were you and where have you been at work in these different memories in my life? And taking that to prayer, you might be surprised what the Lord might reveal. Classically, this idea is sort of captured in that famous Footprints poem. You may remember that little footprint story. The dream, walking on the beach, and there were two sets of footprints in all the good times in the life, but in the difficult times there was only one set of footprints. And said, Lord, there were two sets of footprints in my good times, but how come there was only one set of footprints in the bad times? Where were you? Of course, the Lord reveals, well, those were my footprints as I carried you through those moments. It's an example of the Lord sort of purifying, healing our memories. So as we allow this sermon of Christ that we've been meditating on the last few weeks to work on us, to sort of transform us interiorly, to reorient us, in this particular passage, we might reflect on what are the beams in my own eyes that need to be removed? What are perhaps my unspoken expectations that lead to resentment of others? What am I assuming about people's intentions? Do I assume their best intentions, or do I just assume their worst? And thirdly, as I said, allowing the Lord to work on us in purifying our memories. Doing this may help us to remove the beam in our own eye. So I'll conclude then also with just a word that there is a traditional hymn that's one of my favorites. You may have heard of it, a hymn titled, Be Thou My Vision. It's based on a text of an Irish saint hermit monk from many centuries ago, and was put to an Irish traditional tune. But the phrase, the opening line, Be Thou My Vision, O Lord of my heart, not be all else to me save that thou art. And it ends with, Heart of my own hearts, whatever befall, still be my vision, O ruler of all. Allowing the Lord to shape, to purify our vision of the world of others, to take away that beam that we may see all through his eyes and his active story of redemptive grace. So more and more we may share in the work of with the Lord, bearing good fruit for the life of the world. Amen. We continue with our Sunday Gospel reading in this sermon of Jesus, the Sermon on the Plain as it's known in Luke. And so we've been talking about the last couple of weeks of how the Lord in this sermon is sort of working towards a radical reorientation